few months ago, I ran a full experiment on my iPhone. After 4 years of daily use, the battery health had dropped to 78%, just below the threshold where iOS says performance might be affected. And that got me thinking, if I replaced the battery, would that actually make my phone faster? Or is it just Apple's way of nudging people to spend more money? To find out, I had the battery swapped for a brand new one directly from Apple. Then I ran 15 different tests over multiple days and, well, I tallied up the results. So, does changing your iPhone's battery actually make that big of a difference? Let's break it down. To make this experiment fair, I kept the conditions as controlled as possible. Every test was run after fully charging the phone to 100%, then leaving it for about half an hour to cool back down to a normal operating temperature. The phone was always in the same case with the same screen protector, it wasn't plugged in, brightness was locked at maximum, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth were enabled, mobile data was disabled, and low power mode stayed off. I also repeated the same tests across 3 different days. That way, if there were any outliers or weird results, I could look at the averages instead of relying on just one run. With that said about it away, let's start with the first test, booting up the iPhone. This test was fairly simple, booting up the phone from the Apple logo to the lock screen. With the old battery, times averaged between 16.3 and 16.8 seconds. After swapping to the new battery, that dropped to between 14.7 and 15.1 seconds. On average, about 1.5 seconds faster. Now, 1 or 2 seconds might not sound like a huge deal, and in day-to-day use, you probably wouldn't even notice it on its own, but the important thing here is that the result was consistent, and it was consistent across multiple days. The phone was reliably faster at starting up with that new battery installed. Next up was the application load test. I opened 16 common apps in sequence. Things like YouTube, Snapchat, Instagram, WhatsApp, Gmail, Spotify, Reddit, and even the settings app. With the old battery, this took between 58.1 and 61.2 seconds. With the new battery, the fastest run came in at just over 56 seconds. In the best case, that's about 5 seconds quicker overall. Now, again, a few seconds across 16 apps might not feel dramatic, but if you think about how often we open apps throughout a day, those little improvements start to add up. It's less about one launch being instant and more about the whole phone feeling that bit snappier across repeated use. After that, I tested the camera by taking 30 photos in rapid succession. To make it more realistic, I did this right after opening those 16 apps previous. With the old battery, the phone felt fairly sluggish. There were small delays between shots, and the whole process just didn't feel quite so smooth. With the new battery, that lag was essentially gone. The shutter responded instantly every time, and the phone felt noticeably snappier. This is one of those differences that's hard to capture in numbers, but in actual use, it was pretty obvious. The camera experience just felt faster and more reliable with that new battery installed. Next, I tested web browsing using Chrome. The sequence was YouTube, ChatGPT, Discord, Reddit, and then back to YouTube again. On the old battery, times ranged from about 56 to 58 seconds. With the new battery, those runs dropped consistently to around 53 to 54 seconds. So on average, about 3 to 4 seconds quicker. Now, 3 seconds doesn't sound like much on its own, but this test is a very good proxy for everyday use. When you're constantly clicking between tabs, sites, and apps, those little improvements stack up and make the phone feel noticeably smoother. Then I moved on to a heavier workload, exporting 30 high-resolution photos within Lightroom Mobile. With the old battery, the times were fairly all over the place. On one run, it took more than 2 minutes, while the best came in at just over 52 seconds. Now, that kind of inconsistency was pretty frustrating, but with the new battery, I did see a similar hiccup on the very first run, probably just because it was the first export in a fairly long time. But after that, the results were far more consistent. The slowest was about 1.5 minutes, and the fastest dropped to just 47 seconds. That's a pretty significant improvement. This was the first test where the difference wasn't just measurable, it was also pretty obvious. The phone simply handled demanding tasks far more smoothly. But that's productivity. What about gaming? I tried 2 popular titles, starting with F1 Clash. With F1 Clash, the load time numbers were a little messy, because the game had a major update between the old battery and the new battery run. On one test, the new battery actually loaded slower, but that was clearly down to the update, and I don't believe it was down to the hardware itself whatsoever. What mattered more was how the game played. With the old battery, stuttering was pretty common. The gameplay was okay, but it just didn't feel as smooth as it should. After the replacement, those stutters were much less noticeable, and the game ran more consistently. So, while the loading screen data wasn't perfectly reliable, the actual gameplay experience improved noticeably with that new battery installed. The second game I tested was Call of Duty Mobile, also known as COD Mobile. Just like with F1 Clash, the load time data was a bit tricky because of big version updates between the old and new battery runs. On paper, some of the numbers kind of looked like outliers. But again, the real difference was in how the game actually played here. With the old battery, stutters were common enough that it hurt the experience, but after the replacement, those stutters were much less frequent and the gameplay felt smoother and more consistent overall. So, The takeaway here was the same. Even if the raw load times weren't perfectly comparable, the gaming experience improved noticeably with that new battery. But to really test the performance in a controlled way, I turned to benchmarks. These remove most of those variables and let us see exactly how the phone's CPU, GPU, and overall system behave with the old battery versus the new one. Starting with Geekbench's CPU single core benchmark. With the old battery, the average score came in around 2032, and after replacing the battery, that went up slightly to 2070. So not a dramatic leap, but still a clear improvement. And importantly, it was consistent across multiple runs. Moving to the CPU multi-core benchmark, on the old battery, the average score was around 4,625. With the new battery, that jumped to 4,913. That's nearly a 300-point difference, which is much more meaningful than what we saw with the single core performance. Next was the GPU benchmark in Geekbench. The old battery averaged about 15,971, while the new battery scored 17,179. That's an increase of more than 1,200 points, showing a stronger gain in graphics performance. On AnTuTu, which combines CPU, GPU, memory, and UX, the difference was even clearer. With the old battery, the average score was about 1,043,000, and with the new battery, it climbed to just over 1,122,000. That's nearly an 80,000 point jump, one of the biggest improvements across all of the benchmarks. Then, I ran 3D Mark's first stress test, which loops the Wildlife Extreme benchmark 20 times. With the old battery, the best loop scored around 2,104 and the lowest dropped to 1,764, giving around an 84% stability. With the new battery, the best loop was actually lower at 1,959, but the lowest stayed just a point higher at 1,765, improving stability to 90%. So in this case, the old battery still managed the higher peak score, but the new battery delivered better consistency over time. However, in the second 3D Mark stress test, the results flipped completely. With the old battery, the best loop was 1730 and the lowest was 1512 for about 87% stability. But with the new battery, the best loop jumped to 2201 and the lowest stayed much higher at 1751. That's a massive leap in performance overall. Even if the stability dropped slightly to around 80%, in this test, the new battery clearly outperformed the old one. Finally, I compared battery life directly. After running all of these tests back to back, the old battery dropped from 100% down to 55%. With the new battery, under the exact same workload, it only fell to 70%. That's a 15% improvement in just a few hours of heavy stress testing. If you project that out, the old battery would have gone from 100% down to 0, while the new battery would still have had about a third left in the tank. In practical terms, that's the difference between scrambling for a charger right before you commute home and comfortably making it throughout the entire day. So, after running 15 different tests, what did we actually learn? Replacing the battery didn't just extend the iPhone's lifespan in terms of battery life, it genuinely made a difference in performance too. Boot up times were faster, apps opened a little quicker, browsing felt smoother, and the camera, it was way more responsive. On heavier tasks like photo exports, the improvements were much more dramatic, sometimes cutting times in half. Games also ran more smoothly, and the benchmarks backed it all up with clear gains across CPU, GPU, and overall system performance. And of course, the most obvious change was battery life itself. A solid 15% improvement under stress, which translates to hours of extra use in the real world. So, is it worth the cost? For €99, I'd say yes, but it really depends on your situation. In some regions, new phones are so expensive that keeping the one you already have makes far more sense, and a battery replacement is a relatively affordable way to give it a second wind. With rising prices and new tariffs in places like the US, even older iPhone models are becoming more expensive, whether you buy through Apple or even through a third party. And when you consider how small the improvements have become between new models, swapping out your battery is starting to look like the smarter choice for a lot of people. For me, the upgrade was absolutely worth it. I actually ended up giving the freshly rebatteried iPhone to my mum, who's been wanting one for absolutely ages. And that's kind of the point here. A new battery doesn't just give you longer screen on time, it can restore performance you might not even realize you'd lost in the first place. Sometimes all your iPhone needs isn't an upgrade, just a new battery. Have you replaced your iPhone battery before, or are you thinking about it now? Let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.